It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. 107 people boarded a plane. They stowed their bags, buckled their seatbelts, and looked out the window as Colombia disappeared beneath them. They had no idea. 5 minutes later, the sky tore open. To understand what happened on that plane, you first need to understand what Colombia looked like in 1989. It was not a country at peace. It was a country at war with itself. Car bombs exploded in busy city streets. Politicians were assassinated in broad daylight. Judges were murdered inside their own courtrooms. Journalists who dared to write the truth were found dead the next morning. The Colombian government was fighting a battle on every front. Guerrilla groups controlled the jungles. Paramilitary gangs controlled the villages. And one single man, had his hand around the throat of an entire nation. He was not a soldier. He was not a general. He was a drug lord from the slums of Medellin who had built an empire so powerful, so violent, so untouchable, that even the president of Colombia was afraid to say his name out loud. His name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. He was born poor, raised in a small house outside Medellin. His mother was a schoolteacher. His father was a simple farmer. Nothing about his childhood suggested he would one day become the most feared criminal in human history. But Pablo Escobar had something most men do not: an absolute burning obsession with power, and he was willing to do anything to get it. By 1989, he was running the Medellin cartel, the most powerful drug trafficking organization the world had ever seen. At his peak, he was supplying 80% of the entire world's cocaine. His personal fortune was estimated at $30 billion. Forbes magazine listed him as one of the richest men alive. He had everything, except one thing he desperately wanted: to never face justice. Here is something most people do not know about Pablo Escobar. He was not afraid of prison. Colombian prisons? He had already bribed every judge, every warden, every guard. If they ever locked him up in Colombia, he would be running his cartel from inside his own private cell, with a television, a telephone, and a kitchen that cooked him proper meals. He had done it before. He would do it again. But there was one single word, that made Pablo Escobar's blood run cold: extradition. The idea of being handed over to the United States government, flown to American soil, locked inside a federal prison where his money meant nothing, his connections meant nothing, and his threats meant nothing. In America, he would just be another criminal in an orange jumpsuit. No power, no control, no escape, and that terrified him more than any bullet ever could. In 1989, a man stepped forward who was not afraid of Pablo Escobar. His name was César Gaviria. He was a 42-year-old politician, calm, educated, soft-spoken, the kind of man who looked more like a university professor than a political warrior. But inside that quiet exterior was something Escobar had never encountered before: someone who genuinely refused to be bought, refused to be threatened, and refused to be silenced. Gaviria was running for president of Colombia, and his campaign had one central promise to the Colombian people: he would destroy the Medellin cartel. He would support extradition. He would hand Pablo Escobar over to the United States government, no matter what it cost him personally. When word of this reached Escobar, his response was not panic, it was rage. Because Gaviria was not just another politician making empty promises. The people of Colombia were actually listening to him. And that made him the most dangerous man in Escobar's world. Somewhere in the mountains outside Medellin, Pablo Escobar sat and thought. He had tried everything already. He had bribed politicians. He had threatened judges. He had assassinated police officers, government ministers, even a presidential candidate named Luis Galan, shot dead on a campaign stage in front of thousands of people just 2 months earlier. And still, Colombia kept moving against him. Now Gaviria was rising, gaining votes, gaining momentum, talking openly and fearlessly about extradition on national television. Escobar made a calculation, not an emotional one. A cold, logical, business-like calculation. If Gaviria reached the presidency, extradition would become law. And if extradition became law, Pablo Escobar was finished. So the solution was simple. Gaviria could not be allowed to reach the presidency. And in Escobar's world, when a problem needed to be eliminated, it was eliminated. No hesitation. No guilt. No mercy. He picked up the phone and gave the order. The plan, when it came together, was horrifyingly simple. Escobar's intelligence network had intercepted information that César Gaviria was scheduled to board Avianca Flight 203 on the morning of November 27, 1980. The flight would depart from El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá and land in Cali. A short domestic journey of less than 1 hour. Escobar's men would place a bomb inside the aircraft before takeoff. The moment the plane reached altitude, it would be detonated remotely. The plane would be destroyed, Gaviria would be dead, and Colombia would receive a message so loud, so brutal, so impossible to ignore, that no politician would ever dare speak the word extradition again. That was the plan. Clean, efficient, merciless. What Escobar did not plan for, what nobody could have predicted, was the catastrophic mistake that was already quietly taking shape behind the scenes. A mistake that would change absolutely everything. Escobar did not plant the bomb himself. He never did. That work was handed to his sicarios. A word that in Colombia had become synonymous with one thing: hired killers. Young men, most of them teenagers, recruited straight from the poorest barrios of Medellin. Boys who had grown up with nothing. No education, no future, no way out. Until Escobar found them and offered them something no one else ever had: money, respect, purpose. 2 of these men were selected for the Avianca mission. They were given tickets. They were given a cover story, and one of them was handed a concealed explosive device, powerful enough to tear a commercial aircraft apart at the seams. They knew what they were boarding that plane to do. They knew they would not be coming back, and they boarded anyway. Because in Pablo Escobar's world, loyalty was not optional. It was the only currency that truly mattered. November 27, 1989 began like any other Tuesday morning in Bogotá. The city woke up slowly. Street vendors set up their carts. Children walked to school. Office workers stood in line for coffee. The sky over El Dorado International Airport was clear, pale blue and quiet, the kind of morning that feels entirely safe. Inside the terminal, passengers for Avianca Flight 203 began arriving. Families, business travelers, a group of friends, people with plans for the afternoon, dinner reservations for the evening, phone calls they were looking forward to making when they landed. They checked in. They passed through security. They found their seats on the Boeing 727 and settled in for what should have been a routine 50-minute flight to Cali. Nobody noticed the 2 men who boarded quietly and said very little. Nobody noticed the bag that was slightly heavier than it. Now here is the part of this story that will stop you cold. César Gaviria was never on that plane. At the very last moment, hours before the flight, his security team received a tip. A whisper from inside the Colombian intelligence network that something was wrong, that the flight was not safe, that someone somewhere was planning something. The details were thin. The warning was vague. But Gaviria's team made the decision immediately. Change the travel plans, take a different route. Do not board Flight 203. And so, while 107 passengers settled into their seats on that Boeing 727, César Gaviria was already somewhere else entirely, safe, unaware of exactly how close he had come to death. But the bomb was already on board. Escobar's men did not know. They could not know. There was no way to stop what was already in motion. The doors closed. The engines roared beneath them. Passengers leaned back in their seats. A flight attendant began moving through the cabin. Someone ordered a coffee. A child pressed their face against the window and watched the clouds roll in. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. The Boeing 727 climbed steadily through 13,000 feet. The sky outside was open and endless and completely still. Everything was exactly as it should be on a routine domestic flight on a Tuesday morning in Colombia. 4 minutes. Somewhere in the cabin, one of Escobar's men looked out the window. The ground below was the small municipality of Socha. Green fields, scattered houses, ordinary life going on completely unaware of what was about to happen directly above it. 5 minutes. Then nothing was ordinary anymore. At 7:13 in the morning, the bomb detonated. There was no warning, no final announcement over the intercom, no last moment of understanding for the people sitting in those seats. 1 second the plane was there, solid, whole, climbing through a clear Colombian sky, and the next second it simply was not. The explosion tore through the fuselage with a force that split the Boeing 727 apart in mid-air. The aircraft did not fall, it disintegrated. Sections of the plane separated from each other thousands of feet above the ground. Fuel ignited. Fires spread across the sky. Wreckage, seats, luggage, metal, glass began raining downward in a wide, terrible arc over the hills of Socha below. Air traffic control in Bogotá lost contact immediately. One moment Flight 203 was on their radar. The next, it was gone. Just gone. No distress call. No final transmission. Nothing. Only silence on the radio where a plane used to be. 107 people had boarded that aircraft. Not one of them survived. Not one. In the town of Socha, just south of Bogotá, it was a morning like any other. Children were walking to school. Farmers were already in their fields. Women were hanging laundry in their yards. Nobody was looking up at the sky because nobody had any reason to. And then the sky fell on them. Burning wreckage began raining down across the hillsides and rooftops of Socha, without any warning whatsoever. Massive pieces of twisted metal crashed into fields and roads. Luggage, clothing, shattered glass, things that had belonged to living people just minutes before, falling from 13,000 feet and hitting the ground with a sound that witnesses described as thunder that would not stop. Residents ran into the streets in confusion and terror. Some tried to help. Some simply stood and stared upward at the column of black smoke rising from where a plane used to be. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing to save. There was only wreckage to find. 107 people died on Avianca Flight 203. That is a number. And numbers are easy to hear and easy to forget. So let me tell you who those 107 people actually were. They were mothers traveling home to their children. They were businessmen with meetings that afternoon they would never attend. They were students returning to university after a weekend visit with their families. They were newlyweds. They were grandparents. They were people who had argued with someone that morning and never got the chance to apologize. 3 of them were American citizens, which instantly transformed this from a Colombian tragedy into an international incident and brought the full force of the United States DEA and CIA directly into the investigation. But here is the thing that matters most. Not a single one of those 107 people had anything to do with Pablo Escobar, with politics, with cocaine, with extradition. They just bought a plane ticket. Within hours of the explosion, investigators were already moving through the wreckage fields of Socha. Colombian forensic teams combed through the debris piece by piece, looking for the black box, looking for structural evidence, looking for anything that could tell them what had just happened to Flight 203. Because at that moment, the official answer was still unknown. An accident, a mechanical failure, something far worse. It did not take long to find the answer. Traces of explosive residue were identified in the wreckage within days. The pattern of destruction on the recovered aircraft fragments told a clear and unmistakable story. This was not a malfunction. This was a bomb, a deliberate, professionally constructed bomb placed inside the aircraft before takeoff. This was an act of terrorism, and because 3 American citizens had died in those Colombian hills, the investigation was no longer Colombia's alone to carry. The DEA arrived, the CIA arrived, the FBI arrived. The most powerful law enforcement agencies on Earth were now looking for one man. Before November 27, 1989, Pablo Escobar had enemies, but he also had something else, a strange, complicated layer of public sympathy. In the poorest barrios of Medellin, many people saw him as a Robin Hood figure, a man who built football fields and gave money to the poor, a man who came from nothing and refused to bow to the rich and powerful. For some Colombians, not all, but some, he represented a twisted kind of defiance. The Avianca bombing destroyed all of that, forever. You cannot blow up a commercial aircraft filled with ordinary mothers and grandparents and students and still ask anyone to see you as anything other than what you truly are, a monster, Colombian public opinion collapsed against Escobar almost overnight. The newspapers that had once printed his statements now called openly for his capture or his death. Politicians who had previously accepted his bribes in silence now competed to condemn him loudest. Escobar had made the worst mistake of his life. He had made the entire world his enemy. In May 1990, 6 months after Escobar blew up Flight 203, César Gaviria won the presidential election of Colombia. The man Escobar had tried to kill. The man Escobar had sacrificed 107 innocent lives to stop. The man who was never even on that plane walked into the presidency of Colombia with a historic mandate and a very clear personal mission. Find Pablo Escobar, bring him to justice, end this. Gaviria immediately created the search block, an elite joint task force combining Colombia's best police units, military intelligence, and direct cooperation with the DEA and American surveillance technology. Their one and only purpose was to locate Escobar and shut down the Medellin cartel permanently. For the first time in his life, Pablo Escobar was not the hunter. He was the prey. The man who thought he could blow up a plane and make a problem disappear had instead created the most determined, most resourced, most relentless manhunt Colombia had ever seen. And there was nowhere left to hide. Now we come to the darkest irony of this entire story. Pablo Escobar blew up Avianca Flight 203 to protect himself from justice, to stop one man from reaching power, to send a message so violent and so devastating that no Colombian politician would ever dare challenge him again. It did the exact opposite of every single one of those things. The man he tried to kill became president. The government he tried to intimidate became more determined than ever. The world that had tolerated his existence turned against him completely. And the manhunt that followed, the most intense, most sophisticated, most relentless manhunt in Colombian history, ended on a rooftop in Medellin on December 2nd, 1993. Pablo Escobar was shot dead, alone, hunted down like an animal on the run, the most powerful drug lord in history. Finished not by an army but by the consequences of his own decisions. He killed 107 innocent people, and all he did was seal his own fate. If you want to know exactly what happened on that rooftop in Medellin, subscribe, because that story is coming next.
If you want more hidden Escobar secrets, smash that like button right now. Subscribe and share this video with your crew. Escobar Uncovered, we're just getting started.